going on, guys? It's John here, and I'm here with Larrin Thomas. Larrin, how are you, man?
Doing great, Sean.
Yeah, so professional metallurgist here. He's done a lot of great work here, knifesteelnerds.com. And what do you got going on here for us today, Larrin?
Today we're going to talk about micrographs because I took a bunch of them fairly recently, and we're going to go through a lot of them and talk about what they show us about steel, how I got them, and what they mean for future steels, and that kind of stuff.
Nice. So how many of them do we have total here?
42.
And that was kind of labor intensive, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so I had to buy some equipment to be able to make these micrographs. I've never had my own home equipment. I've always done stuff at either school or work. So this was kind of interesting because I had to buy a bunch of redneck versions of stuff rather than the real equipment to do it.
Okay.
But I was able to make it happen with a pink silicone muffin pan and a gravity-driven disc sander, basically.
So if you could, I mean, just give us kind of the quick and dirty process of what do you have to do? You got a square of metal that's heat treated. We want to see cool pictures of it. Like, walk us through a little bit as far as like what do we need to do to get from point A to point B there?
Yeah, so you got a piece of steel, and I mean, you can look at it at basically any stage. Like, if I had access to it, we could take like the as forged bar before it's even annealed or anything, or even farther up, like cut a square off of a solidified ingot of steel. And it wouldn't look anything like the final product, or it would look very different anyway. But normally knife makers start with, hot rolled and annealed material, and you could look at it in that case. I heat treated all of these, meaning we hardened them and tempered them, because that's the microstructure that the steel is going to have in the final knife.
Okay.
Yeah.
As far as the process, though, I mean, you like sand it. I mean, is this something I can do in like my backyard, or like what would I need to do if I wanted to also like take really cool pictures of stuff?
But yeah, you take the square of steel. You got to look at it from a certain vantage point. So I mean, you can look at the steel from the side of the bar, from the end of the bar, or like straight down onto the steel. I don't know how to explain this better, since
like
you can't.
Grains of wood, right? As far as like if we were going to split wood, the grains would look different, like at the end grain versus like the side crosscut grain kind of thing, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And so we want to look at it kind of from the side. So like
from the side, like the grains like crosscut, we want to see the side. And why is that? Is it because there's some difference between the front and the side? And
yeah, so it's rolled in a single direction. So we have, it's called the rolling direction. It gets longer and longer as they roll it out. And that also elongates the microstructure. And so we can see what the carbides look like relative to the rolling direction.
I see. So basically what you're saying is like if we looked at something like D2, like straight on with the end grain, then all of a sudden D2 non-powdered would look super fine, huh? Almost kind of tricky.
It wouldn't look too bad.
Okay, but then you turn it to the side, you're like, oh, okay, all these carbides are now stretched out. I guess it'll make more sense when we check that out. But
yes. So then I stuck all those pieces of steel in the silicone muffin pan, and and I mixed up epoxy and poured it in there. And the epoxy doesn't do anything in particular other than just hold the steel in place, so that I can put multiple pieces of steel in one mount, and then polish one mount with a bunch of steel in there. So, if you're trying to hold one skinny little piece of steel and dragging it across, some sandpaper, it's very hard to keep it flat. But if you have one larger mount with a bunch of pieces of steel in there, then it's much easier to grind that whole thing flat, and you can do multiple pieces of steel in one go.
Which I got to say, I would have never thought of that on my own. I mean, I would have just been taking like a little square of steel like this and then just rubbing it on a stone. But what you just said was like brilliant. Like when I saw it, I asked you, I was like, what the hell is that? And essentially it's cast inside there. And then all you have to do is you just got to polish that little piece. That's absolutely brilliant, man.
Yeah, well, I would take credit for it, except for I'm just copying what thousands of other metallurgists have already done. They didn't use the pink silicone muffin pan is all. then polish that up to super fine. It's got to be at least like down to 1 micron polish. Finer is better. And then etch it with an acid of your choice. So I used one called Valea's, and Valea was the guy who came up with the etchant. And
clever.
So you use that one so that, you know, it etches the matrix of the steel while leaving the carbide so that you can see the carbide structure. And that's etching in a nutshell. So I have a little cotton swab, dip it in the acid, rub it on the sample for 60 seconds, and then clean it so that it doesn't over etch. And then it's ready to go in the microscope. So all of that up till now you could do in your backyard, you know, with a little bit of ingenuity. The microscope is the part where you'd have to drop some cash or go to a laboratory somewhere.
I mean, I was asking you about that too, right? And I was kind of confused because I was thinking like optical microscopes. I was looking on Amazon. I was like, oh, okay, I can get one of these microscopes, but it's like a special microscope, huh? As far as like,
yeah, I mean, you can buy one on Amazon, but it's going to cost you, you know, at least $800. That's for a pretty low end one. The real ones sold to real labs, like they're going to be several $1,000s. But it's called a metallurgical microscope, meaning the light goes through the lens to the sample, as opposed to the ones that you used in like middle school, where you've got slides that the light passes through. So it's got a light underneath and it goes through like your slide, and then the microscope looks at that light. So
yeah, I mean, once you brought it up, it made sense to me because I was like, oh shit, like you can't see through the metal. So that wouldn't make any sense to have that.
Yeah, so if you want to buy a microscope for looking at steel, you gotta make sure it's a metallurgical microscope.
Good point. So what do we got starting out here? You kind of have these all arranged in a type of order, huh? I mean, we don't just have like just chaos as far as like, here's 42 samples. Like you kind of decided to like put these in the groups, so to speak, for us to look at.
Yeah. I mean, it could be chaos. That would just probably be more difficult to talk about it. So I grouped the first category is high alloy powder metallurgy steels. The reason I did that is because there's a nice progression of more and more carbide. And so when you look at those, you can really see what the carbides are, because as you scroll down, there's more and more of them. So you're like, oh, when he's saying there's more carbide, that's what I'm looking at. So, you know, with Z-Tough, it doesn't have very much carbide, like 3%. But by the time you get to Rex 121, then there's a whole bunch of carbide there. So you know exactly what I'm talking about in the article, as you're seeing, okay, 3% carbide looks like that, and 32% carbide looks like that. So there's a pretty clear difference right off the bat. And these are primarily vanadium carbides, which are very hard carbides that add a lot to wear resistance. And you get more and
now,
more
Larrin,
of it, more vanadium. Yeah.
Some of the viewers watching, I mean, for them, like break down basically as simple as possible, what is a carbide?
Yeah, a carbide is a compound between carbon and another element. Oh, and that's all there is to it.
That's all there is to it, folks. And that's what we're looking at as far as these little round spheres that are lighter in color, correct?
Yeah, I'm pointing at one with my mouse.
Okay.
In Rex 121, you can't miss them. They're usually like the white particles with a darker matrix behind it. Different steels etch a little differently. So, but you can tell what the carbides are after you've looked at enough of these. And yeah, they're very hard particles, and they contribute to wear resistance. They're also brittle, so the more of them you have, the bigger they are, the less tough your steel is, the more easy it is for the blade. Which is
pretty difficult for people to like understand, as far as like, what do you mean I get more, but there's a trade-off? You know what I mean? But everything is always trade-offs, and I think that it's always kind of difficult to steer people back and forth between the trade-offs so they kind of understand, like, okay, this will do this for me really good. This is a trade-off for that. Because that Rex 121, I mean, it's got the most. That's the best, but not always.
And powder metallurgy helps to keep them small. But you can tell even that Rex 121 with over 30% carbide, they're bigger than the steels with 20% carbide. And those carbides are bigger than the steel with 5% carbide in it. So they get bigger and you get more of them. And even though powder metallurgy makes them smaller, like it's not going to make it so a high wear resistant steel is just as tough as Z-Tough. You know, it's not possible with our current technology.
You know which one of these surprised me actually with these really wear resistant steels you have off the bat is that 15V. I was surprised at how much finer it was than the CPM Rex 121 because I was okay, got like 14% like vanadium, and it's also got gobs and gobs of carbon in there as well, which we talked about how those two things are what makes carbides, but they're actually like significantly finer.
Yeah,
compared to Rex 121.
There's a clear difference between those for sure. And I think part of it might be that the Rex 121 has some of the high-speed steel carbides, which are like a moly tungsten carbide. And those...
like an M6C carbide type? Okay.
M6C. And the M stands for either molybdenum or tungsten or a little bit of iron.
Okay.
And those carbides will coarsen more readily. They're not bigger when the steel is atomized, but then they stick all the powder in the can under pressure at high temperature, and they grow easily at that high temperature. And so those carbides can get bigger than the vanadium carbides, which coarsen more slowly. So I think that's part of it.
That is fascinating. I mean, if we look closely at the 15V, like while those carbides are finer, there are some areas where they are clumping versus like 10V. We could see that doesn't have necessarily that issue. So while the carbides are fine, they segregate into like maybe little blobs that are just a little bit, consider them a little bit bigger.
Yeah, so I'm pointing to one right here. Even though you can see, like you said, kind of some outlines of smaller carbides, when they're all joined together, they are going to act like a bigger carbide. So here's another example of one right here. And so as you get more and more carbides, they get bigger, even in powder metallurgy. And you can see 10V, they look a little smaller. There's still like some that have joined up a little bit. And then when you get down to 4V, then very few of them are kind of bunched up like that. You know, there's a little one up here, but it's much less frequent. So the overall carbide size is smaller. And then 3V and C-Tough, you see almost none. They're all kind of discrete particles that aren't really...
And that's kind of a significant factor for why the Z-Tough is the toughest here in this list of pictures that we're looking at, right? Is we have much, much less carbide volume, but we still have enough to do its job, but it's still it's very sparse, more room.
Yeah, so just less carbides, smaller carbides, higher toughness.
Good stuff, man.
Okay, then here's Maxima. It looks kind of similar to 15V despite the presence of those same M6C carbides we were talking about before. So that one was also kind of surprising that it was basically as fine as the 15V.
And, you know, I looked at this last night and kind of my takeaway from it was that the 15V, I felt like there were some patches and areas that they were finer, but there was so much volume of it that they were clumping a little bit. There was some more segregation between those finer sphericals versus I felt like the Maxima maybe was a little bit bigger particles, but more evenly spaced, perhaps. I mean, we talked about this before, and like sometimes it's like you can like look at these pictures and like, wait a minute, I'm seeing something different now, you know, because you're only looking at one spot every time, and so it's important to definitely scan the full thing to make sure you're seeing what you're seeing. But I mean, what's your take on that? Would you agree with that, or is that probably just looking in one spot maybe too much?
Yeah, well, even within a single, you know, you're talking about it within a single micrograph, but I only took one micrograph here. Like I could take 100 across the whole thing and do like a full statistical analysis of the size of the carbides, and you know, then you would really know like the size distribution. But that's a lot of time I'm not willing to commit. So
fair enough. Yeah,
we just kind of have to look at them, and you know, we can definitely see the big differences. You know, to me, it almost looks like Maxima is finer. You know, there is one big carbide right here that's got kind of a black little spot in the middle. So that's kind of interesting. The black spot in the middle is probably some kind of high temperature formation product, either, I don't know, like an oxide or maybe like some kind of nitride that formed at high temp and then act as a nucleation site for the carbide to grow. So it forms first and gets bigger. I can't think of a better way to explain that without using a lot more words. But anyway, that's what it is. But apart from that one spot, it looks pretty fine, at least equivalent to 15V, if not finer, to my eye.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. And you touched up on a good point there too, where like, yeah, you'd have to take a full statistical analysis if you really wanted to like pull hairs. But for the most part, I mean, these micrographs, we're good to go with this. We can draw some good conclusions from what we have here. I mean, that's not taking anything away from the work that's been done here. So
Yeah, the big differences we can definitely see pretty readily. You know, Rex 121 has bigger carbides than Maxima. That's easy to see. We don't have to do a real complex, time-intensive process to figure that
exactly,
out.
we just need to like pull that apart for people to understand, so they're not just trying to always split hairs. You need to, focus on what's pertinent. So what do we got going on next? I mean, we just checked out these really high alloy steels. What do we have going on here? Ooh, look at those big blocky carbides, huh? What do we got here?
Yeah, so I have a comparison between conventional ingot metallurgy, where you have a bunch of liquid steel and you pour it in a mold and then it cools down over like hours. And the carbides have much more time to grow in that situation. So they're at high temperature for a long time. And the steel wants to have big carbides. So we want it to have small carbides, but the steel wants its carbides to be as big as possible, because that lowers the energy state of the steel. And so they'll grow and grow and grow if they're at really high temperature. As opposed to powder metallurgy, CPM crew where it goes through the gas nozzle and it's sprayed by nitrogen gas and it forms really tiny little powder, and those are like all little tiny ingots that solidify in like a fraction of a second, and so there's not nearly as much time for the carbides to grow, and that is why powder metallurgy leads to much smaller carbides.
So essentially, it just bypasses something that happens if you don't do that, right? As far as like, if you don't powder the steel, you get those issues. But by powdering the steel, you bypass that issue where you give it enough sufficient time for the segregation to happen with the cooling of an ingot. Is that what's
Yeah.
going on? Okay.
Yeah, so every little piece of powder is its own tiny little ingot. And so it just cools so much faster than conventional ingot. And it's more expensive, but you get better toughness and better overall properties.
Which is kind of a confusing thing, and we'll touch on it later as far as, because you have micrographs on more simple steels, but you would never powder like 1095 and stuff like that because there's just no reason to. There's just not enough carbide volume, yeah?
Yeah, so 1095, it has simple iron carbides, and they dissolve at like forging temperatures. So while you're forging the steel, there's no carbide in there at all. So you're only forming the carbides when it's cooling down from forging temperature. So the carbides are forming and coarsening at much lower temperatures than we're talking about with high alloy steels. So even though it's not powder metallurgy, the carbides can be very fine. It all depends on the carbide type, how much carbide, that kind of stuff.
Which is, I mean, that's pretty huge, because some people, they only look at it maybe surface value. They're always like, okay, powdered steel. If everything was powdered steel, it's molecularly, it's better. And it's just like, well, not necessarily. It depends on what the steel is made out of, and you would use that process to shrink the carbides from the higher alloy down.
Yeah, I mean, and there are certain manufacturing technologies that can lead to steel with lower impurities. And so for a steel with simple carbides, it's probably better to use one of those than powder metallurgy. So powder metallurgy is not always the best tool for the job.
Now, before we move to this next slide, I mean, we've got actually a good picture of not just carbides, but we also have grains in this one, these kind of honeycomb black outlines
Yeah.
we can
So
kind of
there's
see.
some little black lines in there.
And that'll be kind of cool.
Yeah, different steels etch differently. So some of them you can see the grain boundary, some you can't. And even when you can't see them, sometimes you see them kind of fading out in certain areas. So like I'm following a grain boundary here, and then it kind of gets lost right here. So it's difficult to reveal grain boundaries without specific targeted etchants. And even then, like you need the right etchant for the right steel. So it's very difficult to reveal prior austenite grain boundaries. But a lot of people talk about grain size a lot, especially forging bladesmiths.
Oh, definitely.
And yeah, so looking at the grain boundaries can be fun, though it doesn't always predict the final properties of the steel. But yeah, it's important to differentiate between grain size and carbide size. People get them confused all the time.
It's huge. People know more about grain size than carbide size. And for the sake of brevity for this video that we're making, which is still going to be fairly long, we're just looking at carbides. I guess it's important to point that out for the audience that's watching. But at the same time, if grain size, I mean, you have several articles that go further in depth about that. As far as grain size is something where you always want that to be as fine as possible. Carbide size, maybe sometimes that depends. But as far as grain size gives you both that strength and toughness, which people can read further on your website, Knife Steel Nerds, with a lot of detailed information.
Yeah, there are a few cases where you'd want larger grain size, but in terms of final properties, finer is almost always better, especially for a knife. And yeah, but making the grain size finer does not always lead to like a noticeable difference in toughness. So we've done several toughness studies, and even when we do really fancy heat treatments with tons of cycling and stuff, you think like, oh, it's going to be the toughest ever, and then you can't even tell the difference between the one that you heat treated normally. So
that's fascinating too, by the way. I'm still chasing grain size on some things, and like for you to say that now, it's like, oh.
Yeah. That's why I think doing real testing, like toughness testing, is really important, because sometimes you get
just
lost
looking at it, right? Versus just looking at it and then being like, well, it looks like this, so it's best. But real world, at least with some testing, controlled testing to narrow down differences, what does it matter what it looks like if it's not performing the way it needs to, or give you any kind of discernible value?
Yeah, and sometimes people get lost in their own fantasies of how they're producing superior knives through all these thermal cycles or whatever, and it's not always making it better.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, continuing our powder metallurgy versus conventional technology, we got
normal D2. There's an
D2.
eyesore.
Yeah, it's got D2 is known for its really huge carbides, and they are very big. And you can see they're clearly elongated along the rolling direction, which is the X axis here, horizontal.
That circles back to what we were talking about when we kind of opened up, which probably seemed kind of arbitrary to the people watching. They were like, why are they talking about like the orientation? They didn't get a chance to see it. Now you can see it. This is what we're talking about. This is why you want to take a picture of the steel from the rolling direction, so you can see these big honkers. Look at that, these big old square boys.
Yeah, and then powder metallurgy, it's much less elongated. They're much more spherical. Like there's a carbide here that looks kind of like it's elongated a little bit, but mostly they just look round. And so that helps its toughness in certain directions. So if you're breaking it along the rolling direction, then the cracks can form along those carbides. Where if they're spherical, then there's not such a clear pathway for a crack to grow.
Yeah, that's fast. And then we got in the middle here, we have this spray form, huh?
Yeah, spray form is interesting. Not many knife steels available with spray form. It's kind of an intermediate technology between conventional and powder metallurgy, also intermediate in cost. So it's designed so that instead of forming completely solidified powder, it kind of forms semi-solid powder and then builds up an ingot using all of the liquid powder. So its cooling rate is faster than a normal ingot, but still slower than powder metallurgy. And you can see the carbides are pretty intermediate between the two. And there's definitely
like spraying into an ingot, right? Not hipping it, not condensing powder that's been cooled and then recompressing that, but just spraying it directly into the ingot, I suppose, huh?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Not as good as powder metallurgy, but there's some intriguing things there. I wish there were more knife steels. And these carbides are definitely more elongated, less spherical than the powder metallurgy. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. We'll see if any more steels come up. But spray form's almost as old as powder metallurgy, and it hasn't really caught on. So I don't see anything changing.
Real quick, Larrin, I'd like to share the scuttlebutt about why the spray form might have some advantages. Just a theory. We would have to test it more, but people like the spray form sometimes better than the powdered steel because they feel like it accentuates a coarser edge a little bit better than the finer carbides of the powdered steel. And why people like D2 is they like the coarser aggression that they feel with a low grit edge from the bigger, blockier carbides. But this gives you kind of a nice in between from the powdering process, which kind of more accentuates a polished edge. And this guy's kind of in the middle where you still have a little bit more toughness from finer carbides, but it's just hearsay without further testing, right?
Yeah, I can't really comment too much on that. That kind of sharpening stuff that's very opinion based is really hard, to test. And,
definitely.
To me, the finest steel still feels pretty toothy if you just put a coarse sharpened edge on it. So maybe I'm just not enough of a master to tell the difference.
Or maybe it's all BS. I mean, that's the thing, like with testing and stuff is what really kind of reveals stuff, not just saying like, hey, this is what I think. So I feel like we have a common ground there for sure.
Mm-hmm. And then this is another one I kind of threw out and nowhere land is this M2, conventional
This one
M2 non-powder
surprised the
metallurgy.
hell out of me, actually, because I was like, what the hell? M2 doesn't have big blocky carbides like, uh, what is it, D2?
Yeah. Yeah, M2 looks pretty good. I mean, those carbides are pretty spherical and they look relatively small, especially compared to, like you said, like a D2. And I think they found this also, that Crucible made a powder metallurgy M2 really early on, and they stopped making it because the powder metallurgy didn't really improve it that much.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's one of those interesting things where,
Mind blown, man. Mind blown. Like, seriously, like, what is it? It's got to do with that carbon content in there or whatnot. I mean, it doesn't have like a bunch of bunch of carbon content in there to make big blocky or carbides, huh? 0.80.
yeah, just the different type of microstructure. The D2 is high carbon and chromium. It forms chromium carbides. They get pretty large. And M2 has a little bit of vanadium carbide and the rest those M6C carbides. And apparently they're able to keep them smaller during the solidification and forging process.
I mean, go back up to CPM-D2. I mean, is CPM-D2 even that much finer than the M2?
Yeah, not really. I mean, there are some larger carbides in the M2, but overall it looks pretty good. It looks finer than the conventional crewware too.
Which I was blown. See, I've got this knife I was going to make a kitchen knife out of because I was like, okay, CPMD2, we've got 1.50 on the carbon. And yeah, that should be awesome with the powder. But now that I'm seeing these pictures, I'm like, man, that's not as fine as I thought. And it's just because it has to do with having 1.50 on the carbon. And then chromium carbides are just bigger. I guess we can kind of conclude from all this micrograph stuff, huh?
In powder metallurgy steels, chromium carbides are bigger than vanadium carbides, almost always.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, then the next category is low carbide stainless steels, and these are not powder metallurgy steels.
Okay.
But by controlling the carbon and chromium content, they make it so that you can dissolve and refine the carbides during forging and annealing. And so powder metallurgy likely wouldn't improve the properties of these steels. And the classic example is AEBL. It's
Look
got
how
really
fine that
small.
is, man. That's
Yeah.
crazy how fine that is.
So yeah, if you control the composition and make it so the carbides can be dissolved in forging, you can make the carbide size smaller than powder metallurgy. So ABL is finer than 3V or 4V or 10V especially. And yeah, there are other similar steels in this category. There's LC200N, also called Chronodor 30. It's a little bit coarser than ABL, but still, it's as
Very
fine
fine.
as any powder metallurgy. Nitro V also looks pretty similar. And then one that surprised me was 14C28N is coarser than AEBL, and I thought they would be much more similar.
It's even coarser a little bit than that Nitro V, it looks like.
Yeah, it's I'm not sure why. I don't really know.
Now, as far as, just real quick, we got to kind of take a pause here because people are probably looking at these micrographs and they're like, okay, those are the finest, so those are the best. But it doesn't always come to that, right? As far as where wear resistance is concerned, like, and that's a component of edge holding. These finer structured, finer carbide steels, while they're nice for one aspect of edge holding, like as far as testing on CATRA and things like that, these steels don't do very good, huh?
Yeah, these four we just looked at, they have very poor wear resistance. And part of that is because of how fine the carbides are and how little carbide there is. So, I mean, ABL has half the edge retention of a 3V or a CPM 154.
Ooh.
So, they have twice the toughness of CPM 154, but half the wear resistance. So, nothing is free.
It's also interesting, too, that these are chromium dominant carbides, and these are really, really fine. But then if we just look back up to where we were, we saw that chromium carbides, even in powdered steel, were fucking huge, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it has to do with how much composition is inside the steel as far as carbon, right? Since we talked about earlier how a carbide is essentially a mix between carbon and then the alloying element come together.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a real quick way of explaining the difference between the D2 here and the ABL. The amount is an obvious one, but because there's more carbide in the D2, the carbides are stable all the way up to melting temperature. So you can't just forge it at high temperature and get rid of the carbides. Those carbides are always going to be there. And if you're not fully getting rid of them, then they're going to get bigger. So it's just impossible to keep them small, really. Where the ABL, you're forging it at high temperature, they're all gone. And then they re-come out or re-precipitate as you cool down. And so they're just much smaller due to that fact.
And there's a little important detail before we get on and further in the details. So basically, this is an unheat treated piece of CPMD2. Mm-hmm. Before heat treat, this is mostly carbide, correct?
Yeah, not mostly, but it could have as much as twice as much carbide in the annealed condition. So when you austenitize it at high temperature, the higher temperature you go, the more carbide is dissolving. And so there's going to be less carbide, and they're going to be a little bit smaller usually in the heat-treated condition. Though the first carbides that dissolve are the smallest ones, so it's a little bit complex.
So that's essentially why we have the finer carbides with these AEBL type steels versus the CPM steel, which has more carbides. We're not able to dissolve all these. They're leftover primary carbides versus the AEBL, like secondary carbide. They're all precipitated out, so to speak, eh?
Yep. Then I have some medium carbide stainless steels. These are non-powder metallurgy. So with these steels, it looks fine in some areas, but there's other areas where the carbides were not successfully broken up during forging and high temperature operations. And so there's really huge carbides left over.
Oh!
and those are detrimental to toughness. So we tested the toughness of this steel, and it was not that great. You know, you'd think at 56 Rockwell and with these fine carbides, it'd be super awesome. You know, it's only got 50 points of carbon. But when you've got occasional huge carbides in there, then those are easy places where cracks start.
And this is interesting too. This actually has lower carbon. You said 0.50 on this, and we still get this big old honker in there, huh?
Yeah, and I'm not sure exactly why they can't eliminate these with forging. Maybe it's the high chromium content. You know, these are 15% chromium versus a 13 in an ABL. So maybe that just makes certain carbides more stable. But, you know, during slow solidification, the chromium wants to bunch up with itself. And so you'll have local areas of high chromium, and those can be very difficult to eliminate when you form a carbide like that. Niohmax is another one. So this is an area where it's pretty fine microstructure. It's got some chromium carbides that are bunched up together a little bit, and this angular looking thing is a niobium carbide. But then I found these big areas where there were just tons of very segregated chromium carbides that are much bigger. And so Niohmax has kind of an intermediate composition where you'd hope it would have in-between toughness, you know, in between ABL and like, you know, an S90V or an S30V. But because of these big segregated chromium carbides, it's kind of similar toughness to the powder metallurgy stainless steels. So it doesn't really offer that in-between properties that you're looking for.
Which is interesting. I mean, this stuff doesn't have like a mind-blowing amount of vanadium or niobium, right? I think it was like 0.90 vanadium and 0.70 niobium for this material.
It's less than 1% for both of those.
Yeah, but we get these big old honkers.
Yeah, most of those bigger carbides are from chromium. So maybe if they could control the carbon and or chromium content a little better, they could get rid of them. But they don't seem to be looking into that right now.
Are these like vanadium enhanced chromium carbides? I remember you touched on that with your CATRA testing article about wear resistance.
Yeah, there's probably some vanadium in the chromium carbide, which can increase the hardness of those chromium carbides a little bit for better wear resistance. So the top of the scale is vanadium carbide. They're the hardest. Next is niobium carbide, which is a little bit softer.
Okay.
So those are the ones you want for really high wear resistance. And then below that is vanadium enriched chromium carbides. Then there's a couple different types of chromium carbides, and the M6C, those high-speed steel moly tungsten carbides, they're kind of around the same area as a chromium carbide. And then well under that is then iron carbides called cementite. And those are not much stronger than steel. So they don't contribute to wear resistance as well as a vanadium carbide.
And before we move down, I mean, you've done an article already about niobium alloyed steels and how basically the niobium made a finer carbide under certain conditions, huh? Versus vanadium.
Yeah, so just like we were talking about before with powder metallurgy steels, some carbides are more stable, so they don't coarsen as readily during the high temperature operations like hipping of the canister or forging the steel. And niobium carbides are even more stable than vanadium carbides, so they are usually smaller than vanadium carbides.
Just fascinating, the little caveats and details of all this stuff. It's great. It's great to have you, man.
Yeah.
What got here next? There we go.
Next is Niohmax, another intermediate alloy stainless steel, though it is not available. So this steel is in development, and the purpose of it is to have a small carbide volume, like the ABL or Nitro V or 14C28N, but to replace the chromium carbide with niobium carbides. So it has similar carbide size to maybe like a CPM 154, but with less carbide, and it is niobium carbide. So very hard carbides, a small volume of them, so that it offers high toughness with kind of average wear resistance, as opposed to ABL with good toughness but bad wear resistance.
And I remember kind of your thinking when you were talking about this steel. I know it's not available yet, but you were basically going for like a stainless 3V with this material, right?
Yeah, that's essentially what we're going for. The toughness did meet that target, at least in the developmental heat that we produced. And the question now is where it's going to end up with edge retention. It's definitely going to be better than ABL, but where is it going to end up, relative to a steel like 3V or CPM 154? That's kind of the general area of wear resistance that we're targeting. But it might end up more like the 440C or VG10 range for wear resistance. We're just going to have to see when we do the edge retention testing finally.
And then before we move on, I mean, this is not a powdered steel, but we've already seen before that we don't necessarily need to do powdering of steel for this to have the toughness that you're describing. As far as we saw how ABL, that's not powdered, and it's still finer than the CPMD2 that we checked out, just all based off of that chemical balances that you're manipulating with the material.
Yeah, exactly. The steel was designed to be produced without powder metallurgy with as fine a microstructure as possible. And powder metallurgy is still going to be finer in this case with the niobium carbides, but it looks like we didn't need it. The toughness came out as good as ABL, which is a very tough stainless steel. So pretty happy with the results so far.
Hey, finer than the M2. We were surprised by the M2 up there earlier, and now looking at this, it's like, well, this is not powdered as well, and this is also finer. So impressive.
Yeah, hopefully we can make it available someday.
I want to try it. It's cool. All right, what do we got here?
Okay, now powder metallurgy stainless steels. So none of these have less than about 13 or 14% carbide volume. And that is significant because your really tough powder metallurgy steels, like your Z-Tough 3V, 4V, they all have under 10% carbide. So that's a major limitation of the available powder metallurgy stainless steels. None of them are really high toughness. A 10V steel has around 16% carbide volume. So the lowest carbide volume stainless steels are about as tough as 10V, which if you're talking non-stainless steels, no one thinks 10V is tough, but people argue all day long about S30V versus 20CV or whatever.
They do. It's mind-numbing.
But none of these have really that high a toughness because they have too much carbide in them. So here's an S35VN. It looks okay. It's got kind of a funky structure, not really that spherical.
I got to admit, it was finer than I thought. I definitely, I was coming into this with some biases when I saw the steels you were going to test. And when I saw the S35VN, I was like, that's actually surprisingly finer structured than I thought it would be.
Yeah, it looks okay. It looks good. CPM 154 has much larger, more spherical carbides. And so I think this is just a product of the carbide type, where S35VN has a combination of chromium and vanadium carbides. The CPM 154 is all chromium carbide. We talked about why those get bigger and coarsen more. In our toughness testing, the CPM 154 was tougher than the S35VN, which I still haven't been able to figure out why that was. And I wanted to test some more CPM 154 to make sure that it replicates. But yeah, for some reason, it came out tougher than S35VN.
I'm really curious about that as well. I mean, I have my little goofball nail test that I did where the CPM 154 exploded, but then the S35VN didn't, even though it was 1 point softer, which is probably the most significant factor for why that happened like that, because it still broke out a chunk on the edge. But Yeah, that'd be interesting to see with some more testing because yeah, look how much bigger those carbides are, huh?
Yeah, so it's really surprising. But one thing we might discuss a little more is just carbide structure does not control everything. So there are steels with a really small amount of really tiny carbides, and they are not that tough. So 1095-01, really small carbides, not that much carbide, but they did not test that well on toughness. And that's not just me. You find old papers back, to well before I was born, and the toughness has never been rated that high on 1095. And so there's other factors, like in the matrix of the steel, how much carbon is in there, what other alloying elements are added, how was it heat treated, that lead to differences in toughness apart from just the carbide size. So
Definitely.
a steel like Rex 121 with 30% carbide, you're not making it as tough as Z-Tough. It's not going to happen, no matter how you manipulate the composition. But within a given carbide volume, like 15% carbide volume, there's a wide range that the toughness could be. So B75P, that's Powder Metallurgy BG42, looks very similar to CPM 154, which makes sense because their composition is very similar.
Now we have basically the same kind of carbides between these, right? Except we have vanadium enhanced, like an M7C3 carbide versus up top here with CPM 154. We had more of a 7C3.
Yeah, so the carbide should be a little harder in the B75P. So it could be that this steel, offers a little bit better toughness wear resistance balance. That's a possibility for sure.
Now, between us, to be honest, I was a little disappointed with how much bigger this was in the S35VN. I was expecting this to be looking like the S35VN and S35VN to be looking more like that, but now I'm kind of thrown for a loop.
Yeah, that's not how it ended up.
No.
So here's Vanex, which is a high nitrogen vanadium alloyed steel. And
be fine.
yeah, this one's really fine. And this is because of the process by which it is produced, where they nitride the powder after it's been atomized. So the nitrides form at a lower temperature than the carbides, and that keeps them finer.
Which was really interesting because I was thinking it was just a product of it being nitrogen. Okay, it's just the nitrogen that's making it finer. But you were talking about how basically you can, what was that? Take graphite and add that just like you would add nitrogen to the powders to also make smaller carbides for carbon.
Yeah, the same process works. So you atomize the powder without very much carbon or nitrogen in it. So it doesn't form carbides. It forms like some other weird compounds we don't normally see in steel. And then you either nitride the powder or add graphite, and then you hip it under high pressure, high temperature. And then the carbides form instead of those weird compounds. And so they form at lower temperatures than a normal atomization. So they come out smaller.
Which makes sense because when we look at the BD1N, which is a nitrogen steel that didn't get this really exotic process, which makes that steel expensive as hell. We see some chunkier blocks. So it's not across the board that nitrogen always makes it finer. And even you were talking about in your line of work how titanium nitrides are not very fine at all. In fact, they're one of the coarsest. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah. In automotive sheet steels that I develop at work, we normally get very little carbide. We're not trying to make carbides. But titanium nitrides, we get in really small amounts in some steels intentionally to take care of the nitrogen so it doesn't do other negative things. And those titanium nitrides can be several microns in size.
Finer details, man. Fascinating.
Oh, here's LMAX. It has almost kind of a similar look to S35VN, maybe a little more spherical.
It does.
But it's got a lot of carbide. It's got 19% carbide volume, so toughness is not that awesome. XHP also has a very weird look to it. I don't know exactly why. Not very spherical.
I was really kind of shocked by this one because I felt like with XHP we would have like a lot of the chromium carbide, which we saw was trending as bigger. We're getting bigger spheres, but we look at XHP, they look pretty fine, fine in size.
Yeah, not too bad. And then S90V, it again looks very similar to S35VN, only there's more carbide there. It does look pretty clumpy. Lots of carbides that are connected, just like the S35VN.
Yeah.
Haven't tested the toughness for S90V. I'm a little curious where it ends up.
That would be fascinating.
We know a little bit from data that Crucible has released, but from Crucible's data, it doesn't look that much less tough than S30V. So I would like to see where it ends up.
And you know what the endless argument is what's tougher between S90V and 20CV? I mean, that would be kind of an interesting difference to see.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. And in our toughness testing, 20CV and M390 had very similar toughness, and the carbide structures also look very similar. So this is 20CV right here. It has a similar amount of carbide to S90V, but more of it is chromium carbide instead of vanadium carbide, so less wear resistance for the same amount of carbide. The amount of carbide is roughly equal to the toughness that you get. But the 20CV toughness looked pretty good. The 20CV was as tough as S35VN, even though it had more carbide. So again, differences in grain size or matrix composition or something that gives it good toughness for its level of carbide.
That's interesting, huh? Wow.
Yeah, there's always more surprises. Oh, you mentioned the really fun dragon carbide in it, and of course the carbides are not as fine as other powder metallurgy steels. This looks more like a 440A or something. Oh, definitely some bigger carbides in there.
I mean, we do see some of these little, maybe it's just how you etched it where it's just making it pop more, but I saw that there was like some really nice fine spheres in there as well. And then what'd you call this big one? You said it was like a dragon head or something?
Yeah, it's definitely a dragon head. I don't think that's up for debate. It's definitely a dragon head. And I'm the metallurgist, so I get to declare what it is. Then N690, this is a good example of what conventional high carbide stainless steels look like. 440C or 154 look kind of similar. A lot of carbide, and the carbides are really big, and so they're not very tough steels.
So this is a similar composition to VG10, right? Could we assume maybe that VG10 would look similar to the N690 Cobalt?
No. I think the similarities between N690 and VG10 are overblown. They both have 1.5% cobalt, but N690 looks more like 440C plus cobalt, where VG10 has 2 or 3% less chromium. So that means its carbide structure will be a little bit finer.
Interesting. Yeah, good to point that out, man.
Well, maybe closer to BD1N or something like that. So not as bad as the N690.
Which, I mean, if you stop here for a second, I mean, it was basically like how when you were talking about that 4116 steel versus AEBL, I mean, we've got a low amount of carbon in there, but you were talking about how that 2 additional % of chromium was just clumping it up, huh?
Yeah. Relatively small composition differences can lead to big changes.
Fascinating. Okay.
All right, now we got comparison between Bohler Udahome and Crucible. So here is a Bohler M390 and a Crucible 20CV. And in the past, Bohler and Udahome have advertised their superior technology for leading to better microstructures. But really, they don't look that different. It's not.
No, they don't.
It's not like an order of magnitude difference, like you would expect based on the advertising.
And I'm chuckling because this is like the endless argument on forums and things like that, as far as like, it's 3rd gen powder, so it's finer structured. But now we actually have the pictures between these two things, and we're seeing that, well, they look the same, basically.
Yeah. I mean, maybe one is 10% finer than the other, but I couldn't say for sure.
Well, it wasn't the one we thought either, right? Like it turned out, it looked like the 20CV actually had finer grain and finer carbide, just slightly, ever so slightly.
Yeah, it's hard for me to make a determination. And that, the M390 etched slightly differently. So like the carbides have stronger outlines around them, which kind of changes what it looks like. But I mean, switching to a different steel would make a much bigger difference than switching from Crucible to Bohler. They're very similar.
Might as well just call them the same. I mean, originally we started out this video saying that, like, yeah, you'd have to do a full analysis and really pull the hairs apart. But for the most part, we have this little snapshot in this area that we took. And for the most part, it's going to be similar to the rest that we see. So really, heat treat is really what comes down to the differences between these two things, possibly, huh?
Yeah, and the toughness testing showed that they were basically identical. So
there
I'd say
lay it to rest. It's done.
don't pay extra money for one versus the other.
God, no, please don't.
And here's Crucible 4V versus Udahome Venetis 4 Extra. It's a similar story. The carbides look the same to me, and they have a very similar composition. They're a little bit different, but overall, basically the same.
I mean, this one really surprised me because this is the one that really hits hard as far as like people. I mean, this is significantly a cost difference between these two. Like I had to pay extra for the Venetis 4 Extra, but looks like it's same structure. If you're going off that, I mean, there were other reasons we had discussed on the phone as far as why you would buy the Venetis 4 Extra. It looked like it was popping higher in hardness with lower temperatures, which was pretty nice. But after you got to a certain temperature, they both kind of leveled off.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if the 4V is cheaper and easier to get, it's probably worth just using it instead. So,
yeah, you do pay a premium. You pay a premium for the Venetis 4 Extra import brew.
Yeah, and again, the toughness testing we've done so far, they're equivalent. The 4V was actually a little bit better in the test that we did, but we've only had one heat treatment condition that was identical between the two. And so we need some more comparisons to really show if one is better than the other, but definitely not like a 50% improvement by switching to Udahome Venetis 4 Extra, because in fact the 4V was better so far.
Interesting. Yeah, we'll have to check that out some more, man. That's fascinating.
And then I have Crucible 10V versus Udahome Venetis 8 versus Bohler K390. These do not have identical compositions, but they have kind of the same end result, which is around 15 to 18% vanadium carbide. And
kind of hovering in that area above 4V, right? That A11 class steel area, these three steels.
Yeah, so you give up, the toughness is half of 4V Venetis 4 Extra, but it's also got twice the wear resistance, essentially. So it's it's a good jump from 4V. And it's a good place to be before the toughness really starts falling off a cliff, going to 15V and Maxima and up. So
more extreme, yeah.
Yeah, 10V has been in use since the late 70s, and it's used a lot in industry for a reason, because it's got a really attractive set of properties.
Quick question though: was 10V the first powdered tool steel?
Not the first. So the first powder metallurgy steels were just powder metallurgy versions of existing steels. So a lot of M2s, M4s, T15, that kind of stuff. Then Crucible developed a Rec 76 high-speed steel. That was one of their first unique developments made just for powder metallurgy. But 10V came within a few years of the start of their powder metallurgy development. And it was one of the first that was not a high-speed steel, and it became a big runner for them, and steels like it and 10V itself are still used a lot in the tool and die industry.
Interesting. Now, there's some differences between these steels in particular. I mean, we see that we look kind of the same, but the one that stands out the most is that Venetis 8.
Yeah, Venetis 8 looks a little bit finer than the other two to me. And I think that's just because it has a little bit less vanadium carbide than the other two. So, yeah, it looks intriguing. Udahome claims a significant toughness advantage over 10V. So I'll be interested to test its toughness.
And I think, I mean, based off of some things we can draw from some patterns we're seeing, that, we might be safe to say that it might be a really nice sweet spot in between 4V and 10V when it comes to toughness.
Yeah, it could be. And it only has a little bit less carbide than 10V. So if it does have a toughness advantage, it'd be an interesting one. Okay, let's keep moving. Now we're to the really low alloy steels. They're mostly...
I don't see nothing.
Yeah, you just see the scratches from my poor polishing, and that's basically all that's in there. For some reason, the low alloy steels, I had a hard time getting rid of the scratches, but there's no carbide in 5160 that I can see. There's probably really fine carbides that weren't picked up at this magnification. You'd have to look at it with an electron microscope. But at this magnification, there's really nothing.
shows why this stuff is not very good on like rope cut testing and catcher testing, right? The 5160, there's nothing in there to resist wear.
Yeah, but good for toughness.
There we
And then
go.
8670, you can see a few stray carbides in there, still pretty low for carbide volume. And we measured its toughness. It's just as good as 5160, if not a little bit better.
Now this one was interesting too, because that actually looks like a little bit similar to the Z Tough or 3V as far as like the carbides we can see, right?
Yeah, some of these carbides are visible. They're like at least a micron in size,
Mm-hmm.
but not big enough to really impact the toughness that much. So it's got a tiny bit of carbide, so maybe it's got a wear resistance improvement over 5160,
Yeah.
while also being able to get a little bit harder and similar toughness. So it looks like a good choice for forging guys that want a high toughness steel.
And then just to circle back to what we've been talking about as far as like it may be the same size as a Z Tough and 3V, but those carbides are not as hard, not as wear resistant. 3V will smoke this in the wear resistance.
Yeah, for sure. And then L6, also pretty fine microstructure, though surprisingly not as tough as 8670 in the tests that we did so far. That's surprising because it has more nickel in it, and typically we think more nickel, more toughness.
Yeah.
But that it didn't work out in the tests that we did so far. Maybe we can optimize the heat treatment more and get something that looks closer to 8670. But not a guarantee that the steel is going to be tougher just because it has more nickel in it.
And what are these blooms that we're seeing? I mean, what we talked about that. They call it L6 bainite, huh? That's kind of another name for this steel. Do you think that maybe is some bainite that was formed, or?
Yeah, it might be bainite. I don't know for sure because the etching response is different. So it might be that just this steel etched like that for some reason, but it could be that those blue-looking areas are bainite. I can't say 100%. Normally the etchant that I use is not known for picking up bainite, but I can't rule it out.
Okay.
Then 15 and 20, it's kind of like L6, but it's just carbon, nickel, manganese, silicon. And you can see here that some of those blue areas are surrounding carbides, so it could be kind of an etching response when it's near a carbide.
Okay.
So again, that's why I can't really tell what it is, but
So
still
the most interesting thing here sorry to cut you off. The interesting thing here is what do you think the difference would be between the 15 and 20 and the 8670, with those being kind of lower carbon, both having nickel, but these look pretty different from each other.
Yeah, it is a little surprising. I mean, they all look fine. They all have very little carbide. So, it's all about like which gets harder, which is tougher. And so far, the 8670 is the best that we've tested. So that's the one that I would recommend.
Right on. Good stuff, man.
Then we have the high carbon steels, 1095 and 01 and 52100. So 01 has larger carbides than either 52100 or 1095. One thing that surprised me was that the 52100, the carbides are a little bigger than the 1095. That surprised me because chromium is supposed to reduce the carbide size. So,
interesting.
Yeah, that was a surprise. But the bigger surprise was that 1095 and 01 were much less tough than the 52100.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And look how much bigger these carbides are than 52100. I thought that was interesting. I was thinking the tungsten would make a finer carbide than the chromium.
Yeah, apparently not. But 52100 is known for its really small carbides. It's used in bearings that need really good fatigue performance. So whenever there's carbides present, then cracks start to grow, during use as a bearing. And so 52100 needs a really fine microstructure.
What kind of carbide are we getting in the 01? Is that like an M2 or an M6?
It's primarily iron carbide. There can be a little bit of the WC tungsten carbide, which is very hard, but it has very little of it. So it's primarily iron carbide.
And that WC was a little bit bigger than that VC or NBC, correct? As far as crystal structure?
A bigger crystal structure? I don't know. Yeah. I'm not sure. But it has similar hardness to the vanadium carbide. So the low alloy steels with significant tungsten additions are interesting in that they can have wear resistance approaching high alloy steels, but in a steel that's good for forging. I didn't really look at any of those other than 01, but 01 has a really small amount. So yeah, those are interesting. Cruforge V is another forging steel with a little bit of wear resistance to it.
Justin, giddy up.
Yeah, and so this is another one. You can see that there are some areas that have a little bit bigger vanadium carbides in them. Not enough to drop its toughness that much in the testing that we did. And there's so few of them, it probably doesn't affect your edge that much either. So
now this sample was forged, right? Do you think forging this steel like helps dissolve some of those bigger clumps that are inside the material?
yeah, it can, but you know, the process at the mill is reducing it by a lot more than you would in your home shop, even under a power hammer with heavy stock. So
Really?
the carbide size is going to be set primarily by the mill, and you are likely to mostly just make the carbides bigger due to, you know, lots of time at high temperature where, you know, they heat it up once and they roll it out in just 1 or 2 heats. And they're supposed to have, you know, well controlled schedules for rolling where, you know, they got it dialed in to lead to the best rolling performance and the best final structure. So I wouldn't count on making it finer through forging.
I mean, if we look at this beautiful picture of it compared to the 01, I mean, the vanadium seems to promote a finer carbide. If we look at that one snapshot area versus the 01, even finer than the chromium of the 52100.
Yeah, I think Cruforge V looks like a decent option if you want a little bit of wear resistance in a forging steel.
Tested really good for not being a PM steel. I mean, that's so far that's the most wear resistant carbon steel I've come across.
Yeah, and again, I am interested in some of the high tungsten steels, Blue Series, F2, 1.2562, 1.2519. The German designations are just random numbers strung together.
Oh, they're the worst. 07, I can remember that. 1.2519.
Yeah,
that's a mouthful.
Yeah, and then there are steels that are just like one number different from each other, but then one might even be a stainless versus another one. So it's impossible to keep them all straight.
Pure chaos.
So then I have toughness measurements that go along with all of that, and I'm getting so tired that I can only talk about it so much. But just like I was saying before, the 1095 and 01 are very similar in toughness and not as good as you would think it would be based on their small carbides. 52100 is much tougher. The Cruforge V a notch below the 52100, but still really good toughness. You know, at 66.5 Rockwell, it's similar in toughness to the 1095 and 01 at 6062.
I think it's good for you to point out those details as far as pointing out the hardness, because I think when people first glance at these charts that you have, they just look, okay, what's the toughest? You know what I mean? Yeah. They don't actually factor in that the graph goes out on the x-axis for how hard the material is and then try to put that in perspective. They just look at face value. Okay, 8670, next chart. You know, they're not actually like sitting there really trying to pick it apart.
Yeah, and so you can offer some different interesting combinations of, you know, stability from high hardness plus toughness if you choose a steel with high toughness that can also go up to high hardness. So there's some property combinations there that aren't pursued that much that could offer some interesting things. As opposed to just making 59 Rockwell 8670 with super high toughness. Then Z-Tough has the highest toughness of anything that we've done over 60 Rockwell. So it's nearly as tough as the 8670, but at 61.5 Rockwell. So the Z-Tough looks really interesting. It's got a little bit of vanadium carbide for a little bit of wear resistance, but just as tough as anything. So again, another...
More boom boom looks the same. We saw the pictures; they look the same, but the carbides themselves were harder. So we have that toughness, and then we have boom, much more wear resistance and hardness as well. That's really cool.
It's an interesting one. Then the intermediate carbide Z-Wear, that's CPM Crewwear and Venatus 4 Extra. They have pretty good intermediate toughness. Rex 121, really bad toughness.
It's strong as hell, but you don't want to put any impact on that stuff at all.
Don't drop it.
Don't drop it.
The conventional Crewwear is like half as tough or less than the CPM version, so that shows the effect of carbide size as opposed to just volume like the Rex 121.
Mhm.
D2, conventional D2 has relatively low toughness, and the spray form version, PSF 27, is about twice as tough. Haven't tested the CPM D2 yet for toughness.
And just real quick, I mean, what we only tested one plot for M2, looked like. I'm looking at the PSF 27 line, and it looks like it blends right into the M2.
Yeah. Yeah.
So dang, that's actually surprising for how hard that M2 was. But then also the PSF 27, I mean, we saw that the carbides were a little bit larger than the M2, but they got about the same toughness at 64, huh? I mean, look at that.
Yeah, both do pretty well. So. And then stainless steels, we've got a big spread, from N690 with its big carbides. This is also relatively hard, so you'd think we could boost this toughness a little bit by going down in hardness. Versus the AEBL with really high toughness, basically as tough as any of the carbon steels, just about. Then Niohmax, similar toughness, maybe a little tougher at higher hardness for some reason. Z Finite is the LC200N Chronodor 30, also pretty high toughness.
Yeah, that did good, actually. I'm surprised how good that did, the Z Finite. When we looked at that structure, it was super fine. It was close to the ABL in a way.
Yeah, so it's a good choice if you need really high corrosion resistance in something that also has high toughness. It is difficult to get it to very high hardness, but for certain applications that need high toughness, high corrosion resistance, it's a good choice. X50 with its occasional really large carbides, its toughness is not that great considering we tested it at just over 57 Rockwell. It's like similar to powder metallurgy steel with much higher wear resistance.
Interesting. What's throwing me for a loop here is the fact that we have LMAX Vanix and M390, which had the finer looking carbides in the CPM 154, but that CPM 154 really sticks out, as far as like the carbide looked like they were bigger. They didn't have the vanadium and stuff in there. But it looks like that tested tougher. But then we have 40 CP, which also is very chromium dominant steel, which maybe would look similar to the B75P, B70P, and the CPM 154. But we got CPM 154 like boom up here.
Yeah, and that's one of those mysteries. What are the other factors that are playing in here? Why was the CPM 154 tougher? And I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
So Carpenter, they don't really push the 40 CP, that's powder metallurgy 440C, because their XHP tested tougher than the 40 CP.
Yeah.
And so, why did it do that? I don't know.
Just goes to show, man. I mean, just more testing is needed. We're not just pulling all this information out. Like, people can send in samples to you, and you can Sharpie test them.
Yeah, can't wait.
Woo.
Okay, I can't talk that much more.
So this is good.
Oh, I'm worn out.
All right. I'll tell you what, Larrin, you've shared enough with us. We've seen the rest of this. I think we can just go ahead and end this here. So yeah, Larrin, thank you so much for sharing with us, man. I appreciate that. We really dug inside of that brain of yours, and we pulled out a bunch of information, a lot of the finer details. It's really difficult to share this kind of stuff without kind of having a conversation about it, because as soon as you make a video about it, talking about something, you look in the comments and then there's all these new questions and you didn't cover all these different details from all these different points of view. So I think when people can hear a conversation between two people about it, it's like, oh, okay, that makes more sense. So yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate it. It's a good video. Good job on all these 42 micrographs. I don't envy you for all that work that you did to to polish and etch all of these. Wow.
Yeah. Thanks, Sean. Next, I'll just have to do 42 more, and then we can talk for another 72 hours.
Oh, hell yeah. All right, man. Take it easy.
All right. Bye, Sean.